Our Inspirational Indie Authors podcast stream is proudly sponsored by Book Vault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with Book Vault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. I'm Howard Lovey of the Alliance of Independent Authors and book editor at howardlovey.com. And you're listening to Inspirational Indie Authors. Every episode, I interview an Ally member to find out what inspires them and how they are an inspiration to other authors. My guest this episode is Tony Park, an Australian thriller writer who lives in Southern Africa. After a journalism and PR career, Tony changed his life completely, splitting his time between Australia and the African bush, where he draws inspiration from the land, the people, and the wildlife. He's built a global indie career by taking control of his rights and expanding to new markets. I'll let Tony Park tell his story.
Hi, my name's Tony Park. I'm an Australian who happens to live in South Africa, which happens to be where my novels are set. I'm the author of 22 thriller novels set in Southern Africa, mostly contemporary with a little bit of dip into historical fiction as well in a couple of those books, but set in the places I love, which are Africa's great game reserves and national parks. So the environment, wildlife, and in particular, unfortunately, the lucrative trade, illegal trade in endangered wildlife features in my novels. I also write some nonfiction on the side as a ghostwriter, and together my novels with my nonfiction book allows me to make a living as a writer, as I have done for about the last 10 years.
Before we go into your current work, tell me a little bit more about how and where you grew up.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm Australian. I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, which for people who don't know, it's a very urban environment, right? I mean, a lot of people, when they think of Australia, maybe they think of the outback and Crocodile Dundee and adventurous landscapes. I grew up in a very suburban area, a town on the outskirts of Sydney, not particularly well off. Both of my folks worked 2 jobs, in fact, to make ends meet. My dad worked in a garage and a service station during the day, and in the evening he cleaned up in a bar. My mother worked as a secretary by day and also worked as a cleaner at nighttime. And so my little brother and I spent our time after school every day until the early evening in the local library. It was kind of, free childcare, unfortunately, for this particular community. So I grew up around books, and my mum was a voracious reader, and she got me reading at an early age. And I fully believe that's the best gift that a parent or a grandparent can give to a kid. And I remember as a little kid walking around a very modest local library. It was like one big room. It wasn't even much of a library. I just remember walking up and down those shelves as a little kid thinking, someone must write all these books. I thought, wouldn't it be good if that could be your job? Because, like adults are always asking you, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I would say, I want to write a book. At which point they would pat me on the head and say, maybe you should be a plumber. Maybe you should be a motor mechanic, which were the options that seemed to be around for kids where I grew up. And sometimes I wish I had been, But this was a dream that I think my mum had probably been responsible for planting in my head. And as I got older, I also wanted to be a helicopter pilot. We lived across the road from an area where the Australian Army used to fly its helicopters on training missions. This is sort of around the Vietnam era, in the late 60s. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could be a helicopter pilot and a writer? And as soon as I got a little bit older and started going to school, I learned very quickly that to join the Air Force or the Army as a pilot, you had to be able to do maths and physics. So I was never going to be a helicopter pilot. So I pinned my hopes on writing, and to cut a long story short, wanted to do it. Had a couple of failed work attempts at doing different jobs, and I ended up getting a job as a journalist on kind of local newspapers, community newspapers, and found that, I really did love writing. And then later moved on to work for the government in Australia in a PR role, then for public relations companies, but always harboured this, as so many of us do, just to write that book.
I assume that kind of launched your interest in journalism. What kind of journalism did you practice? Was it mostly local stuff, or did you do anything on the national level?
Yeah, it was local stuff, and I think it was a very good grounding because I worked on a couple of different suburban newspapers. The first newspaper I worked on had 4 reporters on it, so we had to cover everything. Even though I was just starting out, it was kind of quite a ruthless environment. I loved it, and it was fun and collegiate, but also quite ruthless because virtually from day one, you're almost expected to fill a quarter of the newspaper. So you had to sink or swim. A couple of people passed through and sank, So I had to learn the craft of writing on the job. There wasn't time for training. Even back then, this is in the mid-'80s, like journalism degrees didn't really exist. They were just beginning, and it's not like it is today. And newspaper reporters, it was an apprenticeship. We were like, in the States, they're cub reporters, right? We called them cadets. So you very much learned on the job. And one thing I liked was we covered a little bit of everything: government, local government, missing animals, human interest stories, crime, courts. I used to really like going to court and covering court cases because, number one, I didn't have to go chasing. I was not a foot in the door investigative reporter. I lacked the kind of the aggression or the drive to be, hounding people. But I found when I sat in the court, these mini dramas played out before my eyes every day. And it could be something like a shoplifting case, or a drink driving offense. But behind the crime was always a story. And people were talking, so I would have to record their dialogue. I'd have to pick up the atmosphere of the scene. And for someone who had always wanted to write a book, I thought, I'm seeing these little mini stories play out, often beginning and middle and end in front of me. And I started thinking, people say, write about what you know. I've had journalist characters in my books, in a couple of them. But I think working on the paper cemented that drive. So even to the extent that after doing that for a few years, I kind of knew I didn't really want to go further down the journalism path. A lot of my peers moved on to work on the big metropolitan daily newspapers. Some went to television. A girl I used to work with went to television. But for me, it kind of had the opposite effect, that seeing all these little stories, all these dramas unfolding really cemented that urge to want to write. And I had quite a few tries, I would try getting up early in the morning before work with my typewriter, with my manual typewriter back then, trying to work on a novel. And it was just like all too soon it was time to go to the office. And then in the evenings I would try, but I'd literally been typing all day. And this continued for a number of years, even as I progressed into public relations. I might have had, maybe 7 or 8 novels where I got maybe 3 chapters in, and it was just, I take my hat off to anybody who can hold down a full-time job. And because I'm afraid to say I couldn't, but it also prompted me to take a really dramatic change in my life in about 1995, after I'd been married by that stage for about 6 or 7 years. And I went to my wife Nicola, and said, I want to write a book. And she said, you don't talk about anything else. I said, I've got a plan, and my plan is, how about I quit work and you support me? And that's what happened. She gave me 6 months to try and write a book, and I made a drastic, one of those kind of, I think I had got to a stage in my career. I was about 31, 32 then. I thought, I can chance this, because without wanting to sound boastful or anything, I thought, if I failed, I can probably find another job. I was kind of young enough to be, and young enough and probably arrogant enough, dare I say, to think, if it fails, I can go back to work. And, it did.
Hats off to your wife for allowing this, for, I can imagine that conversation. Honey, I'm going to quit my job and you'll support me while I do this thing that's not really a sure thing. So after journalism, you went quickly into PR before setting off on your own. Why did you make that kind of transition?
Money is the truth of it. Journalism is one of those occupations, certainly in Australia, that lots of keen young people, many of them, I guess, aspiring writers, want to break into. And I think these days it's a smaller industry, right? It's shrinking over the years with the advent of social media and more online news and stuff. It goes way back. So it's getting tougher to get into. And wages are not good. The pay is not good, because the media companies know that, and it gets worse every year with traditional news outlets shrinking. This never-ending queue of people who are drawn to it want to get in, and a lot of the proprietors know, look, they don't have to pay very much, and they'll still get a lot of keen young people that want to join. PR was the kind of way for journalists in my era to sell out, let's call it what it is. But I think also for me, as I said, I wasn't wed to pursuing the journalism path, and it was still writing. I was still writing, okay? Though some of the stuff I was writing about was not as interesting as I was when I was a journalist. And it was probably also, now that I think about it, not a bad thing to do, because after a few years of that, while the money was good, I started to really realize that, life is not about money, right? It's about, following a dream. And it was working in a PR company where I actually progressed to a spot where I was second in charge of this Australian arm of a global PR company. And that's when I popped the question to my wife, would she support me? And I must say, I was sort of half expecting her to say no, but she did say yes. And then the next difficult conversation I had to have was with my boss, say, hey, guess what? I'm leaving.
Yeah. Well, you must have had some kind of plan. You weren't just going without a parachute. Did you already have manuscripts in the works?
No. And I'm afraid to say I did. I did not have a plan. But I think, what I have worked out is that, and like I said before, I really take my hat off to people who can balance a full-time job and writing, because for whatever reason, I couldn't. And maybe it was because I'm not sure about your experience in it, but I was writing all day, and to come home and now I'm going to write another couple of hours, but tough. But I just thought I needed to press pause on my life, and I needed to just see if I could write a book. I actually gave my wife, we kind of struck a deal, my wife and I, that I would have 6 months to write a manuscript. Now that also set me up, I think, for the future, getting used to working to a pressure, to a deadline. And I just wanted to see if I had it in me, if I wanted to do it. So I think, part of my, journey, if you want to call it, is very much about collaboration. It's about the fact that I did have that support from my wife. And as it happened, I wrote a manuscript, but it didn't go anywhere because it wasn't any good. But I learned quite a bit from the writing process, in that I learned I was not a plotter, because I was woefully unprepared, Howard, I must say. I'd read a couple of books about how to write, and they both said, you should have a plot, right? You should have a beginning, middle, and end. You should know your characters. You should have character profiles. And I wasted the first month or two of my 6 months just trying to think of a plot. And that was really difficult, really hard. And then when it came to writing the manuscript, I didn't find it particularly enjoyable. And I thought, wow, this is the one thing in life I've always wanted to do. My wife's given me 6 months to do it. And you know what? It's not much fun. And it's actually really hard work. And it got to the end of that period, and I knew I had failed. I went through the motions of sending that book to just one publisher to get a rejection letter, which I got, because I wasn't happy with it. And if I'm not going to be happy with it, I mean, even my mum didn't like it. She was very polite. She said, oh, yeah, very nice, Tony. Very nice. When your mum says very nice, it's terrible. So that was a learning experience. And that was part of it as well.
Well, was the plotting was that too scientific for you? Some of us are pantsers, by the seat of our pants. And that's the way I write. I have the characters. I have an idea of where I want to go. And sometimes the characters have different ideas about where they want to go.
Yeah, I just found it too mechanical. I found it was almost like trying to assemble a model kit or something, or, trying to build a house. And I was a kid that flunked, woodwork or shop, as you would probably say at school. So I'm not good at assembling things and bolting things together. And I didn't even know that there was such a thing as a pantser, or that you could just make it up as you go along. That first book was set in the Australian outback in the Second World War. So I did all these things that I shouldn't have done. I spent too much time researching. I put too much historical fact in there. I hadn't been to the places that I was writing about. So it wasn't as though I was writing not even writing something that I knew about. To tell you the truth, I wrote a book set in the outback of Australia because I thought maybe people overseas in America and England and Europe would want to read a book set in the outback, which is like rookie mistake 101, right? I mean, writing something for someone else, not writing something that you want to write yourself. But all this was a huge learning experience, and it didn't kill my desire to write, but I just knew I had to find another way. And as it happened, that coincided with our first trip to Africa, which was in 1995.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that. That's when things suddenly kind of clicked for you.
Absolutely, yeah. So my wife, Nicola, is the planner in our household. So when it's holiday, when it's paying the bills, she's the one with the passwords to the online bank account and all that kind of stuff. And so when it comes to planning holidays, she's the one that does all the research and used to get the guidebooks out pre-internet. So she said, we're going on a safari holiday to Southern Africa. And I was like, cool. And that was my level of involvement with the whole process. She did all the booking, she organized everything. I never realized that I was going to be driving because she hired a car. I knew she was hiring a car to drive around Southern Africa. I thought, hey, this is weird because she doesn't drive. So I'm saying, am I driving on this holiday? And she's going, yes, you are. It'll be fine. And so what we did is she booked us a rental car for 3 weeks, and we did a self-drive safari through South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana in 1995. And I think because I was so monumentally unprepared for what happened, that's why it hit so hard. That's why Africa hit so hard, because I hadn't even really thought about this place or this continent or its wildlife. And the very first place I drove to from the airport was the place that's right across the river from where I'm sitting now in South Africa. It's the Kruger National Park, a national park the size of some countries. It's the size of Israel. And we just drove through the gates in this little rented car and started having the most amazing close-up encounters with elephants and lions and leopards, and this whole sensory overload just floored me. And I think by the end of that first trip, we had definitely planned on coming back. So it wasn't going to be a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We got hooked by this continent, not just the wildlife and the scenery, but as I started talking to people, everybody had the most amazing story. People had lived through wars and famines and sometimes crime and political upheavals. And along the way, they'd been chased by a lion, or really trampled by an elephant, or they'd worked as a mercenary in the Congo, or something like that. Yeah. It's crazy, crazy. And I thought, hey, maybe I could write about this.
So, yeah, it sounds like rich material, and you were like a kid in a candy store. Can you trace real life encounters or people that eventually made it into your books?
Yeah, I can. Like I always say, I don't base my characters on real people, but I certainly borrow real people's stories and work them in either as ideas for new books. So on our third, we went back every year after 1995, and on our third trip in 1998, what had happened was I did go back to work after my first manuscript flopped, but I went back to work in a different way. I went back to work back in PR, but I went as a contractor, as like a freelancer. So I would do freelance work for a number of different PR companies. And my wife, who works in IT and human resources, she did the same thing. She got a job with a consultancy that allowed her to go to different companies doing things on her own time. And so while we were working full time, we started to change our lives so that we could spend more time in Africa. So we would work really hard in Australia as contractors, save up a bunch of money, and then go back to Africa and spend maybe a longer period of time. In 1998, we went for 4 months, and I bought an old Land Rover, and I started writing again. And what I did this time is I thought, hey, why don't I just make it up as I go along? And I then subsequently learned that is a thing. But what I did was, as we were driving around, I started listening and learning about issues. At the time, elephant poaching was still quite big in Mozambique, and there had been a big elephant that had been lured out of the protected area, out of the national park, by unscrupulous hunters to be shot for its ivory. And I thought, well, this could be the basis of a novel. And that first book that I wrote, it's a book called Far Horizon, is set on a tour around southern Africa. And so the premise is something that happened about this iconic elephant being killed. But the day-to-day was, as we packed up our old Land Rover and our tent and moved to another camp, so too did the characters in my novel, because I set the novel on a tour, like a group tour around southern Africa. It was just my wife and I. But I had this cast of characters, and they were traveling with us. And they would go from national park to national park, game reserve, town to town, wherever we happened to be. That first novel was almost like a diary of our travels. And I found that worked. So rather than researching, I was just using those skills that we have as a journalist. As a journalist, you're a trained observer, looking, listening. How do people speak? What's the weather like? What do things smell like? What do things look like? And I would just kind of record that in my novel as the descriptions behind the story. And to cut a very long story short, I went back to Australia, and very luckily that book was picked up by Pam Macmillan Australia and published as Far Horizon in 2004, 21 years ago. And I've done a novel a year at least since then. And,
wow, Sam, yeah. So you found the right formula. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was lucky because I did have a traditional publisher, which I'm very grateful for and very thankful for. But my journey changed over the years. I still have that deal in Australia and South Africa, but I've gone through a process of taking back rights in some territories, and self-publishing now in the UK, US, and EU. And that is a decision that I am so pleased that I made. Another one of those kind of life-changing moments where I kind of took control of my own destiny.
Yeah, yeah. Were you unhappy with the traditional publishing process or unhappy with the lack of control? What made you kind of make that shift?
I don't have, bad words to say about my publishers that I've had over the years, and I realize it's a business. I think what I've learned over the years is there's very little emotion. I mean, when I first started in publishing, traditionally published back in 2004, it was a very different landscape. It was pre-ebooks, it was pre-everything, pre-streaming, pre-smartphones even, so books were booming, sales were booming. And if your first couple of novels didn't do well, a publisher would stick with you, try and nurture you. Today, it's very much sink or swim. I've seen good writers who've maybe written one book and because it didn't take off, they've been cut. It's a ruthless game in traditional publishing now. And so I had deals in the UK and the US, and I ended up with a good kind of fan base, but not really big enough. My publishers kept me going. I was getting good advances, but I wasn't earning back those advances. And I found that being an Australian who then got a deal in England, and that UK publisher then distributed my books to South Africa, where, funnily enough, the books were doing really well. This is now my biggest market. And in South Africa, I have fantastic readership and my sales are still growing commercially. But even though I was selling well, because my contract was an Australian contract that went through the UK publisher, then went to South Africa, I was making virtually nothing per copy, like a pittance. By the time everyone had taken their cut. So I, in that case, took the decision to buy back those rights for South Africa. At that time, the UK publisher says, if we're going to do that, there's no point us continuing to publish in the UK, which I was cool with because I was selling, probably not enough to justify them keeping me on, but where I was doing really well, I wasn't being rewarded for it. And I had to start treating writing not as my dream come true, which it is, right? It is my dream come true, and I love it. I feel blessed. I feel so thankful that I can make a living from my writing. But I've also learned in the last few years, and it's coincided with the growth of the indie publishing scene, the advent of things like Vellum and ebooks and selling direct, that I can now also do what my publishers always did, and that is treat it as a business. So I would say to people, follow your heart, follow your dream. But if you want to make a living out of it, you've got to treat it like a business as well too. And so that's driven a lot of my decisions to go indie, because I do have a good, loyal, wonderful fan base in the UK. Is it enough to get me in the top 10 in the UK? No way. Absolutely no way. But is it enough to provide me with another really good income source? Absolutely, And in South Africa, where I do sell well, I should be getting the compensation that I should be getting for those books. So
Did that surprise you Did that surprise you that you suddenly became a business person? Because you mentioned that your wife usually handles all the money.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Howard, it's terrifying for me. She calls it my publishing empire, which is like a cottage industry. But for me to start looking at books and looking at returns on investment and how much do I spend on advertising, is it worth it? I've just spent quite a lot of money setting up direct sales from my website with the help of my web guys, which I'm super excited about. But now I'm like the businessman thinking, gee, this is like living on the edge. I've got to make this money back now. I've got to now convince my readers to stop buying from the major online retailers and buy from me, which is going to require me to invest in advertising. For someone like me, who's a writer, not a business person, it's scary, but I have to do it, And sometimes in writing, you meet writers by nature can be introverted people. And I've met some who said, I don't want to go out and talk in front of an audience, or I don't want to be on social media. And I'm like, well, don't say you want to make a living out of your writing. It's hard. It's a harsh truth. So I think, we've got to find that inner business person that lives hopefully within all of us.
You're doing what we recommend at an Ally. We've been talking about selling direct to readers. So that it seems like a good business decision, but like you say, you're kind of going out without a parachute right now. So, but do you see opportunities there?
Yeah, I think so. And let me just say, I love Ally. I really do. It's the best money I've spent as an author, I think, probably in the last 5 or 6 years is investing in that membership. Just such a wealth of resources and information, this wonderful collegiate atmosphere, and getting to talk to people like yourself. It's such a good, and that's one thing I love about the indie community, because when you have to deal with the traditional publishers, they kind of take you to lunch once a year and slap you on the back and take you a little book tour if you're lucky, although that's disappearing for 2 or 3 weeks of the year. And the rest of the year, you don't really hear from them. Whereas we have a community, which is fantastic. And I've taken a lot of information from Ally and from the testimonials of other people in working towards this selling direct thing. But I think it's exciting because one of the things I've seen in 21 years, I have seen this whole big, funny publishing industry just go through the most momentous shifts and changes. And I just think selling direct is just that latest new thing that we've got to have a look at, and maybe get on board with. And I think readers have to as well, too, because some of my readers say, I'll never buy an ebook, I only read print. And then some of them, I'm sure, are very happy just buying their book with one click. But if I can convince them that, hey, we'll all be better off if we look at buying a different way, that'll be fun, too. Readers are evolving as well.
Yeah. Not only readers, but listeners, which is a good segue to audiobooks. And you've had quite a journey there. It seems like your stories might be really conducive to audio because they're very immersive. Tell me about kind of the long process you undertook to get audiobook narration.
Yeah, so I'm lucky in that I have a good relationship with Belinda, which is Buil, that's the Australian audiobook company. And they've been with me pretty much since they began. And I now do deals with them. My Australian publisher deals with them for Australian rights, but I negotiate separate deals with them for the rest of the world. And those advances I get from Belinda also helps me bankroll some of my indie publishing. Like it pays for my covers and, it'll pay for an editor if I'm not getting my books professionally edited by Pam McMillan. One issue I have had over the years is because I wasn't responsible for picking the narrators, the publisher was. My books contain an awful lot of Afrikaans words, the local language here, a lot of South African place names, which are based on, local cultures and things. And my narrators happened to be British or Australian, and they kept getting things wrong. And I had probably more negative and more vociferous criticism of my audiobook narrators than anything I'd written in the last 21 years. It has been a long process, but it's one of those things I think too, where I think as writers, a lot of us when we're first published or starting out, we're kind of so excited and so grateful to be part of this that sometimes we maybe don't stick up for ourselves enough. And I've had to learn that too. I've had to learn that I can be a nice guy, and I am a nice guy, and I'm like working with people and collaborating. But sometimes you just have to say, hey, look, we need to change this, because it's not working for any of us. So now I'm really lucky. My last couple of books have had very good narrators who happen to be South African by birth. So if you're looking to cast narrators, I think it's really important that you don't just like the sound of their voice, that, that you're on top of those nuances that go into probably pretty well any book, that they get them as right as they certainly can.
I'm making the mistake of narrating it myself, which is a very long process. I'm also an audio producer, so I thought I'd produce it myself and narrate it myself. And I had a book come out a month ago, and I'm still working on the audio book. So
that's amazing. Again, I take my hat off to you. I'm one of these guys, I hate the sound of my own voice, so I don't think I could listen to it.
I do too. So believe it or not, I have to cringe every time I listen to myself editing. But I think that's normal. Now, you've also been involved with foreign rights, both as a traditional author and independently. So what's your strategy when it comes to selling rights?
Yes, I've been lucky. I had a couple of overseas deals. I had an agent for a few years that started off with my agent, but I've continued those in my own capacity. So most of my books have been translated into Hungarian. I've had a lot in Bulgarian. I've had a couple in Italian. I've had one in Dutch, one in Czech, so one in Latvian. So yeah, it's kind of, different sort of markets, different things. I like it because if I can get those right, it's another little source of income. I've signed up with DropCap in the States recently to see how that'll go, whether that might help me, get some more deals. But I've also started pursuing it on an indie basis because I have a good friend here in Africa who, like me, she loves the South African bush. She loves the African wildlife. She and her husband are friends of my wife and I, and she happens to be a retired teacher. And her hobby is translating books into German. I better not mention her name, but she's a wonderful person. And so she said, why don't you let me translate some of your books? And she would do it for fun. I said, well, that's great. So I did a little joint venture with her where she translates the books and we self-publish in Germany. And it's taken off. It's taking off quite quickly. It's not huge numbers, but Germany is had been my probably fourth biggest market, say fifth biggest market. And since we started doing the German translations, it's probably climbed up to number 4. And while those were previously German readers, obviously people who love Africa, right, probably travel here every year like me, they were reading in English. But now half of my German sales pretty well dead on the German translation. So there's certainly an uptake in it. And she uses DeepL, the professional version of the AI translation software. And she reckons that gets her about 75% of the way there. And her job is to then edit and fix up. So when I first looked at translations, when I embarked on my kind of indie career about 8 years ago, when I started publishing in the US and the UK, self-publishing, sure, I started checking out translators and wow, you spend an awful lot of money on a professional translator. And I just thought, I'm never going to make that money back. Doing a joint venture with my friend, she takes 50%. Get this, she gives her 50% to charity. She is such an amazing person. That's and cool. So I've got lucky. So I'm one of the first, I'll be the first to criticize AI and say, oh no, I hope it doesn't all put us out of work. But listen, it's doing things and it's changing things. And
there's a human behind
Maya
it
is
too.
still and Maya's a translator. Like that's what she's doing for fun. Okay. But if you're a professional translator, maybe it means that you can do 10 books a year instead of 2 books a year now. Maybe it means you can make more money. Maybe you don't make as much per book, but your output can increase. So yeah, it's just a really interesting case study. So I'll be watching that space and seeing how it goes. Yeah.
It sounds like translation is a good way to use AI as long as there's a human behind it as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's like I use Vellum because I'm a Mac user. And that revolutionized my life because I was paying typesetters up until about 3 or 4 years ago. But as good as it is, you still need to check it. You still need to go through and check it. So yeah, these are tools in our toolbox, I think.
So where are you living now? Are you living in South Africa or in Australia?
Yeah, living in South Africa pretty much full time now. I used to do 6 months. My wife and I got temporary residency a few years ago and we're applying for permanent residency. We love it. We love the lifestyle here. If any of your listeners, I would certainly recommend a holiday to Southern Africa. Many different places you can choose. It's got a really good publishing scene here too, like a really good book scene. I've just done 3 writers' festivals in the last month. And in those writers' festivals has been a mix of traditionally published people, self-published people, seminars on self-publishing. I did a webinar yesterday for a South African writers group about the sort of things we talk about on Ally, and I recommended every one of them sign up. I recommended everyone join if they want to learn more and develop their skill base and meet people in that space, and learn from each other. So it is quite a vibrant publishing area, and the publishers are targeting markets from previously disadvantaged backgrounds, people in the African community who now have an improving standard of living, more leisure time. A lot of the publishing is aimed at that kind of African middle class market. There's a lot of women's fiction coming out now. I'm finding my readership is becoming more diverse, ethnically diverse as I go on, which I think is fantastic. It's just there's enormous potential for growth here in South Africa in so many ways. Yeah.
Well, I know that Ally has ambassadors all over the world. I don't want to volunteer you for anything, but if that's not something you're interested in pursuing.
Sign me up. I think I'm doing it already. I didn't even know I was, but I am, because, there's no end of forums and things that you can be on. But I love, the daily updates, the weekly updates that we get. I always find something interesting to listen to or watch or learn from. So I think it's a really good hub for all of us to have.
So what's in the immediate future for you?
So I have a new novel called Die by the Sword that comes out July 29 worldwide. Thanks to the wonders of independent publishing, I can say that. Here out worldwide in print, ebook and audio from July 29. That's a dual timeline thriller set in South Africa. And I do ghostwriting, as I mentioned. It's my day job. If writing novels is living my dream, then I'm a ghostwriter in my spare time. And I was just given a commission to write the history of a private wildlife reserve here by the owners, which I have found absolutely fascinating because it's allowed me to dive deep into South Africa's rich history as well too while writing that book. And that'll probably come out early next year sometime. So writing full time, writing every day, editing every day. I get 2 weeks off a year, Howard, and when I get that 2 weeks off, I sit by the pool and read books. That is my life.
Well, sounds like you're busy. I know ghostwriting projects can be very time-consuming too. So,
but I'd recommend them for people who are interested in, pursuing writing as a career. that's kind of what tipped it for me about 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, when I did my first one. I found that my novels are quite long, about 100 to 120,000 words. So they take up, at least half the year for me to write one a year. And in my spare time, when I said the second half of the year, I used to go back to work in PR like 12, 13 years ago. But then I found that if I could do a ghostwriting project in that second half of the year, that then allowed me to say to my wife, hey, you know what? I think I'm paying my share of the bills for once. So, and ghostwriting is, it's writing. And I think that what I like about it is, it's like going back to journalism. You're meeting those interesting people, writing their stories. And still, to write a good autobiography, I still think, you employ those three key basics, that people like Stephen King talk about in on writing. You've got to have the dialogue. You've got to have the narrative, you've got to have the description, and you've got to coax all of those out of your subject when you're a ghostwriter. You can't just write a monologue, you've got to write it like a novel. That's what I always say to the people I'm co-authoring with. We have to write this like it's a novel. We have to have description and engage the reader's senses, and you have to remember what you said on this day. So we need dialogue in there. So I like it. I treat each of my ghostwriting projects like a novel. I wrote one called Rhino War, which is the true story of a retired South African general who was brought out of retirement to head up the anti-rhino poaching fight in the Kruger National Park near where I live. It's an amazing story of this old guy being brought in to try and fix this big bad problem. But it had drama and it had action, and the human effort and toll that was going on to protect these animals was probably more crazy, more out there, and more action-packed than any one of my thrillers could ever be. So, yeah, if you get the right subject, a ghostwriting gig can be just as much fun as writing a novel.
And I'll bet your boss, your CFO, your wife is happy about the income as well. So.
The CEO is.
Well, thank you, Tony. This has been a great conversation about your indie publishing journey, about your kind of life of adventure. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Look, thank you for your time and for running this fantastic series, and for allowing us to have a voice, and for all the work that Ally does as well, too. Thanks for your time and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. You've been listening to Inspirational Indie Authors. I'm Howard Lovey, Content and Communications Manager at the Alliance of Independent Authors and book editor at howardlovey.com. This podcast stream is proudly sponsored by BookVault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with BookVault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. If you are a member of Ally and would like to be considered for the show, please write to me at howard@allianceindependentauthors.org and tell me what inspires you and how you can inspire other authors. As always, find more author advice, tips, and tools at our Self-Publishing Advice Center, selfpublishingadvice.org. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our organization and become a self-publishing ally. You can do that at allianceindependentauthors.org.